Hello again everybody, and another in the series of talks about buildings. This time we're moving away from the Colosseum and the catacombs, and we're moving to a small temple with a lot of religious significance for the Romans, and this is the Temple of Vesta. It's one of the smallest temples in central Rome, and it's also one of the most important, symbolically speaking. It's strictly speaking not a temple, since it didn't house a cult statue of Vesta, but in most ways it is a temple because it has a very important religious function. It housed a statue which was said to have come from Troy, which I'll talk a little bit about later, and it also had the eternal flame, which had huge symbolic importance for the Romans. The idea was that as long as the flame kept burning, then Rome would stand, and if the flame was allowed to go out, then Rome would be at risk. And there are a number of stories from Rome's history about the extreme measures which were taken to try and keep the eternal flame alight. That whole idea of the eternal flame, incidentally, that's where the origin of eternal flames on war memorials, particularly to unknown soldiers, comes from. It was cared for, this little building, this little temple was cared for by the most unusual priests, or rather priestesses. Now the goddess Vesta, in whose name this building was dedicated, was the deity of hearth, and therefore the centre of the Roman family life. Her temple in the 1st century BC seems to have been made out of, well, we're not quite sure, but it seems to have been a rather ramshackle, flimsy affair, made perhaps out of straw and mud with some sort of conical roof, and it looks really pretty unimpressive from the coinage evidence. When it was rebuilt, it was built in a circular temple. It was 50 feet in diameter, 50 Roman feet, and this is exactly the same as another temple which was built near to the banks of the river Tiber. Now this is important because not that much of the Temple of Vesta survived, and that's because a lot of the stone from it was robbed in the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. But we can have more of an idea of what it actually looked like, we think, because the round temple near the river Tiber, whose dimensions it shared, was made into a church, and thus was spared from the ravages of using it as a quarry. So it was, we know, made out of marble, and a bit of that survives and has been reconstructed so to give you a little idea of what it actually looked like. It had 20 Corinthian columns which went around its circumference. And again, it is similar to the round temple near the river in that. There are one or two bits of this have remained, and so using the round temple as a model, it's all been kind of a little bit put back together again. It was clearly an elegant and understated building, and yet its position, which is at one end of the forum, overlooking many of the important buildings and places of political significance, shows its importance. There was a building next door which is usually called the House of the Vestals. Pre-fire of 64 AD, this was perhaps somewhat simpler and more convent-like, but after the Great Fire of 64 AD, seems to have been substantially rebuilt, massively increased in size, might have housed the quarters of the Pontifex Maximus, but certainly it was the house of the Vestal Virgins, and it appears to have been a very nice place, very much a des res right in the middle of Rome. Certainly much bigger than was needed for the 6 Vestals who actually lived there. So who were these 6 Vestals? At any one time there were 6, and they came from citizen families with both parents still alive, probably from patrician or the most aristocratic families, because this was a great honour. They were selected by the chief priest when they were little girls, somewhere between the age of 6 and 10, and they stayed as a Vestal for the next 30 years. The most important vow they had to take was to remain chaste for that time. And if they were found to have lost their chastity, the punishment provided for in law was to be buried alive, and a special underground chamber was maintained for that purpose in what was called in what is now the Piazza Independiente, which is near Termini Station. Then it was the Campus Sceleratus, the field of crime. So if they stayed safe and if they stayed chaste, they received great privileges during their lifetime, but that was a very severe punishment if they transgressed. Their duties were relatively simple. Their job was to keep the sacred flame and to look after the Palladium, this wooden statue of Pallas Athene, Minerva in Roman terms, which was supposedly brought from Troy by the refugees, originally by Aeneas and others. So they also had to sprinkle the shrine of Vesta with sacred water, and they had to assist at some other religious ceremonies in the city, and they kept the wills of important people, including emperors. Privileges, they were kept at public expense for the time that they were Vestals. They were always first in line for anything. They always got the best seats at the Colosseum and the Circus Maximus, and they were allowed to travel in carriages in the city, which was a very rare privilege indeed. We also know that they had very heavy and traditional clothes, perhaps masking their feminine figure and sort of disguising their sexuality. And they also had very complicated hair with lots of fancy braiding and so on. Perhaps something which was only imitated at other times by other women on their wedding day. There is one curious little story which shows the kind of status and what was expected of the Vestal Virgins, and this is recorded by the historian Livy in Book 4 of his History of Rome, and he says, this is a story in which a Vestal Virgin is accused of being too smart. Postumia, a Vestal Virgin, was tried for incest, a charge on which she was found not guilty. But suspicion had been aroused by the fact that she was always got up rather prettily, and that she had a wit that was too loose for a virgin. Wonder what that is. Delivering judgment on behalf of the board of priests, the chief priest told her to stop making jokes, and in her dress and appearance to aim at looking holy rather than smart. Now I wondered on reading that story whether this is an early example of religious authorities just being rather frightened of women and using any old excuse to oppress them.